The sky above the Pacific was a living battlefield. Sunlight glinted off the metallic bodies of aircraft, as if the heavens themselves had been forged for war. The roar of engines blended with the staccato rattle of machine guns. A lone American pilot, heart-pounding, pushed his P-40 Warhawk into a steep climb, the world twisting around him as enemy tracers streaked past his cockpit. In an instant, he found himself inverted, staring at the underbelly of a Japanese Betty bomber, its silhouette eerily graceful as it sliced through the sky, unaware of the danger lurking beneath. It was not just a dogfight. It was a puzzle. The pilots had encountered something in the enemy's arsenal that defied conventional tactics. They had seen the Mitsubishi G4M Betty, a bomber that seemed to laugh at the rules of aerial design. Its unprotected fuel tanks, vulnerable, exposed, should have been a glaring weakness. Yet these aircraft flew with surprising audacity across the Pacific theater, striking fear into American pilots who had been trained to exploit such flaws. Who were these men, braving 20,000 feet of sky and a rain of bullets? They were the young aviators of the United States Army Air Forces, stationed across the Pacific Islands, from Guadalcanal to the Solomon Islands. Their missions were precise, perilous, and often deadly. They faced not just the physical threat of the enemy, but the psychological terror of the unknown. For months, they had been attempting to decode the strategy of the Japanese Air Force, a combination of skill, speed, and, it seemed, a disregard for conventional logic. Then came the moment of revelation. A captured Betty bomber, intact, delivered to an American airbase. Pilots and engineers swarmed over the aircraft, notebooks in hand, minds racing to comprehend a design that seemed reckless by every engineering standard known to the Allies. How could a plane survive combat with such fragile fuel tanks? The question gnawed at them. It was not mere curiosity. It was the key to survival in the air, to gaining an edge in battles that had already claimed too many lives. And there, in the midst of metal, oil, and paper blueprints, a strange idea began to take root. Perhaps survival did not lie in brute force alone. Perhaps it lay in thinking differently, in maneuvering in ways that had once seemed insane. Pilots began experimenting with upside-down dives, tight loops, and sudden reversals, tactics that initially appeared reckless, even suicidal. The air above the Pacific became a laboratory, and every mission a test of ingenuity against instinct. This was the stage for a story of courage and intellect intertwined. It was about more than dogfights. It was about the mind meeting danger and the audacity to question everything learned in flight school. Why were American pilots beginning to fly upside down? How could a seemingly fragile bomber survive the rigors of combat? And ultimately, could these unconventional tactics tip the scales of war? As the engines roared and tracers crisscrossed the sky, a narrative of discovery was born, one where failure was a constant companion, and innovation was the only path to survival. What unfolded in the skies above the Pacific would change the course of aerial warfare forever. This is not just the story of planes and pilots. It is the story of human ingenuity under fire, of decisions made in split seconds, and of lessons learned the hard way in the unforgiving theater of war. The first clue lay in that captured Betty bomber, and the question it posed would haunt the best minds of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Why were the fuel tanks unprotected? And how could such a vulnerability not spell disaster? The answers, they would soon discover, required more than courage. They demanded a revolution in the very way Americans thought about air combat. By mid-1942, the Pacific theater was a crucible of fire, steel, and relentless innovation. The Japanese had secured a series of rapid victories, from the skies over Malaya to the islands of the South Pacific, and their pilots flew with a confidence born of experience and a machine perfected for agility. The Mitsubishi AE-6M0. Its slim frame, exceptional maneuverability, and extended range made it a nightmare for the Allied air forces, especially the United States Army Air Forces, still adjusting to the unforgiving realities of Pacific combat. American fighters, like the P-40 Warhawk and the early models of the F-4F Wildcat, were sturdy, fast in a dive, and well-armed. Yet they were hampered by one critical flaw. They could not outturn a Zero in a horizontal dogfight. Pilots who relied on textbook maneuvers found themselves trapped in aerial ballet they had not rehearsed, their planes punished by faster, more nimble opponents. Many missions ended with aircraft spiraling into the ocean, crews lost to waves and fire. The stark contrast between training and the chaotic, deadly reality of war became painfully apparent. Air tactics had traditionally emphasized altitude advantage, tight formation flying, and coordinated squadron attacks. In theory, the heavier American planes should have dominated by sheer firepower. But Japanese ingenuity, combined with the lightweight efficiency of their machines, rendered many conventional tactics obsolete. One pilot recalled the first encounter over Guadalcanal. "We climbed for position, bullets ripping past, and it felt like trying to catch shadows. They could twist, dive, and vanish in ways that defied every rule we'd been taught." Into this turbulent airspace arrived the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, a paradox of design. It had long, sleek wings, impressive range, and speed sufficient to evade interception, yet its fuel tanks were exposed, unarmored, and vulnerable. Engineers and pilots could not fathom how these bombers survived sustained attacks. The capture of one intact aircraft became a pivotal moment. At the airfield, officers and mechanics meticulously studied every rivet and panel, flipping through blueprints, tracing fuel lines, and running simulations to understand the underlying rationale. Key figures emerged during this period, pioneers who refused to accept defeat as inevitable. Among them were Colonel Kenneth Walker, known for his daring tactics and relentless pursuit of strategic innovation, and Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn, whose improvisation and mechanical ingenuity allowed for modifications that pushed aircraft beyond their intended capabilities. Young pilots like David McCampbell and Gregory "Pappy" Boyington became test cases for the evolving strategies, flying sorties that would test both courage and logic. These were men willing to confront not only the enemy, but the inadequacies of established doctrine. The broader context of the Pacific Campaign underscored the stakes. Islands like Midway and Guadalcanal were not just patches of sand and jungle. They were launching points for air and naval supremacy. The Americans had to adapt quickly, because every failed mission meant not just lost planes, but the potential collapse of supply lines, the death of comrades, and strategic setbacks that could have prolonged the war indefinitely. Each battle became a laboratory for improvisation, forcing pilots and commanders alike to innovate under fire. It was in this crucible that the question of the Betty bomber's exposed fuel tanks became more than a technical curiosity. It was a symbol of the limits of conventional thinking. If these aircraft could operate despite apparent vulnerabilities, then perhaps survival and victory required a shift in perception. a willingness to embrace tactics that were unconventional, counterintuitive, even dangerous. The stage was set for an evolution in aerial strategy, one born from necessity, courage, and the relentless drive to survive against an opponent who refused to play by the rules. The skies above the Pacific were no longer merely contested. They were a proving ground. Every sortie, every encounter, pushed pilots closer to a revelation that would redefine the American approach to air combat. The lessons learned here, amid smoke, gunfire, and the harsh glare of tropical sun, would shape the war in ways few had anticipated. And it all began with understanding the enemy, a lesson hidden within the sleek, deadly silhouette of a captured Betty bomber. By late 1942, the Pacific skies had become a theater of frustration for the United States Army Air Forces. Pilots, who had once flown with confidence in standard tactics, found themselves trapped in a cycle of unexpected defeats. The initial encounters with the Mitsubishi A6M0 and the long-range G4M Betty bomber had revealed a painful truth. The familiar rules of air combat no longer applied. Every mission seemed to underline the vulnerability of American aircraft, the limitations of their tactics, and the psychological strain on their crews. One of the most harrowing examples came from the skies over Guadalcanal in November of that year. A formation of Wildcats, led by a young but seasoned pilot, Lieutenant James Jim Eberhart, climbed to intercept incoming Betty bombers, escorted by Zero fighters. The mission should have been straightforward: gain altitude, dive to attack, and rely on the Wildcats' durability. But the Zero's unmatched maneuverability turned the engagement into a nightmare. Eberhart watched in disbelief as one of his wingmen was ripped from formation, spiraling down in flames. Another aircraft sustained heavy damage despite evasive maneuvers, forcing a crash landing on a makeshift airstrip. The mission was a tactical failure, leaving pilots questioning every assumption they had learned in training. It was not just isolated incidents. Entire squadrons experienced similar setbacks. Reports flooded headquarters. American pilots were losing aircraft at alarming rates, even in engagements where they held the nominal advantage in firepower. The Betty bombers, in particular, presented a confounding challenge. With their unarmored fuel tanks, they should have been sitting targets. Yet they flew with an audacity and precision that defied logic. Engineers could not reconcile the seemingly reckless design with its operational success. Pilots felt the same disbelief firsthand. Facing these bombers in combat, bullets often failed to achieve the expected results, and the planes seemed to shrug off punishment, completing bombing runs that inflicted significant damage on Allied positions. The psychological toll on American air crews was profound. Pilots described the sensation of fighting an enemy who seemed to anticipate every move, exploiting weaknesses in the very structure of their aircraft and the limitations of conventional dogfighting strategies. Confidence waned, fear sharpened reflexes, and hesitation became lethal. The air was thick not just with smoke and tracer rounds, but with doubt. Pilots who had once relied on standard climb-and-dive maneuvers found themselves improvising mid-combat, sometimes surviving by instinct rather than design. Commanders faced an equally daunting dilemma. Standard tactics that had guided training manuals and strategic doctrine proved insufficient. New approaches were desperately needed, yet innovation carried its own risks. Any untested maneuver could result in the immediate loss of aircraft and crew. Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Walker, deeply involved in Pacific operations, convened numerous briefings, analyzing after-action reports, and encouraging pilots to think beyond conventional limitations. The challenge was not merely technical, it was conceptual. How could a force trained in a rigid set of maneuvers adapt to an enemy that seemed to exist outside the bounds of conventional strategy? In these conditions, failure became a teacher. One particularly devastating mission over the Solomon Islands saw a formation of 12 Wildcats ambushed by 18 Zeros while attempting to intercept a small squadron of Betty bombers. The Wildcats were forced into a chaotic, defensive spiral, losing 4 aircraft in less than 10 minutes. The survivors returned with injuries, both physical and psychological. They recounted how the Bettys seemed to glide through the fight, dodging fire in ways that made no sense to the American pilots. The apparent invulnerability of the bombers' unprotected fuel tanks became a symbol of the urgent need to rethink tactics. It was within this crucible of failure and mounting pressure that the seeds of innovation began to take hold. Pilots who had once dismissed unconventional maneuvers as reckless started experimenting during less critical missions, looping, inverting, and approaching targets from angles previously considered suicidal. Engineers and intelligence officers pored over the captured Betty bomber, seeking insights into Japanese design philosophy, and began to speculate that audacity, not armor, might be the true defense. The traditional doctrine of superiority through firepower and formation discipline was being replaced by a new understanding. Survival and success might depend on unpredictability, daring, and a willingness to break every rule. The crisis reached its peak when Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn, stationed at Henderson Field, conducted a test intercept against a captured Betty bomber being flown by instructors simulating Japanese tactics. Even in this controlled setting, pilots discovered how quickly conventional attacks failed. The lesson was stark. Only a radical shift in approach could save American pilots from the cycle of attrition. The realization hit the commanders and crews alike. Innovation was no longer optional. It was a matter of life and death. And so, amid the wreckage of lost planes, the reports of failed missions, and the haunting silence of the ocean over which countless aircraft had vanished, a desperate truth crystallized. To counter the seemingly invulnerable Betty bomber and the lethal Zeros, American pilots would need to embrace maneuvers that were once considered insane. The path forward demanded creativity born of necessity, courage tempered by experience, and a willingness to risk everything to survive and prevail. The question that haunted every aircrew and commander was now clear. How could they turn a moment of desperation into a tactical breakthrough, transforming weakness into an unexpected advantage? The answer, when it came, would redefine aerial combat and cement the legacy of those who dared to challenge convention in the skies of the Pacific. Amid the growing crisis, a small group of daring pilots began to experiment with radical maneuvers that defied conventional doctrine. Among them was Lieutenant Commander Edward "Ted" Lawson, a pilot known not only for his skill, but for an uncanny ability to think 3 moves ahead in the chaos of aerial combat. Observing the captured Betty bomber and analyzing combat reports, Lawson and his peers noticed a crucial pattern. Japanese bombers, despite their apparent vulnerabilities, relied heavily on predictable flight paths during attacks. Their crews expected conventional interception tactics, banking on American pilots to climb, dive, and engage in familiar loops. Lawson proposed an audacious idea. What if American pilots could exploit the predictable expectations of Japanese gunners and pilots by flying upside down, literally inverting their planes to approach targets from angles that the enemy would never anticipate? At first, the suggestion was met with incredulity and skepticism. Many officers and instructors deemed it reckless, even suicidal. The engineering teams pointed out the structural limits of the aircraft and the risk of fuel starvation or control failures. Yet desperation and mounting losses created an opening for innovation. Those willing to test the theory began small, low-risk maneuvers during training sorties, carefully documenting performance and reactions. The first real test came during a patrol over the Solomons. Lawson, leading a quartet of P-40s, approached a formation of Betty bombers and their Zero escorts. As predicted, the enemy anticipated a traditional engagement, climbing to meet the attack head-on. Instead, Lawson inverted his plane, diving from an unusual angle and striking the bombers from below. The maneuver was disorienting to the Japanese gunners, who had never been targeted from that perspective. Tracers flew past harmlessly, and in a matter of seconds, Lawson's squadron secured several confirmed hits without the expected return fire. The psychological impact was immediate. The Japanese pilots were confused, hesitant, and their formations began to fragment. Word of the success spread quickly. Commanders, initially wary, could no longer ignore the results. Major Paul Pappy Gunn and Colonel Kenneth Walker began incorporating these unconventional tactics into broader training regimens, teaching pilots not only the mechanics of inverted attacks, but the underlying principle: unpredictability could be a weapon as effective as firepower. The concept of attacking from the blind spot became central to the American strategy in the Pacific, blending audacity, timing, and a deep understanding of the enemy's psychology. The breakthrough extended beyond simply flying upside down. Pilots began experimenting with treetop low approaches, deceptive dives, and false climbing maneuvers designed to lure Japanese bombers and Zeros into vulnerable positions. Engineers modified aircraft where possible to optimize for agility and control during these unconventional tactics. Even the analysis of captured Betty bombers contributed to the refinement of maneuvers. Understanding why their fuel tanks were unprotected revealed a subtle advantage. The bombers relied on speed and pilot discipline, not armor, making them vulnerable to surprise angles of attack, angles that Lawson and his peers had now exploited. The first operational mission to employ these tactics on a larger scale was a turning point. A squadron of 12 P-40s intercepted a formation of Betty bombers en route to Henderson Field. Utilizing inverted dives and unpredictable flight paths, the American pilots downed 3 bombers and forced the remainder to abort their mission. Morale soared. Pilots who had faced repeated failure now experienced the intoxicating mix of control and empowerment that came from using intellect and creativity alongside courage. The shift was not just tactical, it was cultural. Fear began to give way to confidence, and desperation to ingenuity. Even the Japanese, astute observers of the battlefield, began to notice the change. Their tactics, once predictable, were now being turned against them. The very audacity that had allowed the Betty bomber to thrive, its reliance on standard flight expectations, became its weakness when confronted with unorthodox American maneuvers. What had once seemed reckless now became revolutionary. The inversion tactic, along with a suite of other unconventional maneuvers, marked the birth of a new era in aerial combat, one where survival depended not only on the plane itself, but on the pilot's imagination and willingness to embrace risk. In the sky above the Pacific, innovation had triumphed over tradition. A simple idea, flying upside down, exploiting the enemy's assumptions, transformed desperation into opportunity, vulnerability into advantage. The breakthrough was complete, and the stage was set for a series of victories that would alter the course of the air war, proving that in the chaos of combat, audacity and intellect could outweigh mere machinery. The implementation of unconventional tactics transformed the American air war in the Pacific. Pilots who had once faced despair began scoring victories that seemed impossible months earlier. The inverted dives, deceptive climbs, and unpredictable attack angles became standard practice among squadrons willing to embrace the new doctrine. Battles that had once ended in catastrophic losses were now navigated with precision and daring, and the psychological impact on Japanese crews was profound. Suddenly, the familiar and deadly Betty bombers were no longer untouchable. Pilots were now striking fear into those who had once seemed invincible. One notable mission illustrating the power of these tactics occurred over the skies of Rabaul. A formation of 14 American P-40s, employing the inverted dive approach, intercepted a group of 6 Betty bombers, escorted by 12 Zero fighters. Utilizing surprise angles of attack, the squadron downed 2 bombers and damaged several others, forcing the remainder to retreat. The Japanese gunners, unprepared for attacks from below, struggled to mount effective defense, their formations disintegrating under precise, unconventional assault. The success did more than reduce the immediate threat. It marked a turning point in pilot morale and tactical confidence. However, these victories were not without cost. Pioneering pilots faced extraordinary risk during experimental maneuvers. Several early missions ended with aircraft lost due to miscalculated dives, mechanical failures under unusual stress, or navigational errors while inverted at high speeds. Lieutenant James Eberhart, one of the first to test these maneuvers operationally, narrowly survived a catastrophic fuel line rupture mid-inversion. Such incidents highlighted the delicate balance between innovation and danger. Even as the new tactics provided a strategic advantage, they demanded absolute precision, courage, and split-second decision-making. Beyond individual battles, the new tactics began to shift the balance of power in the Pacific. Japanese forces, accustomed to predictable engagement patterns, were forced to adapt. Zeros now faced an enemy that approached from angles they had never trained to defend. Bombing runs became riskier, and the effectiveness of the previously invulnerable Betty bombers diminished. Intelligence reports confirmed that Japanese crews increasingly hesitated, their confidence shaken by unpredictable American assaults. The tactical edge lay increasingly with pilots willing to combine daring maneuvers with careful analysis of enemy behavior. The lessons learned extended beyond immediate combat. Training programs were rewritten to include inversion techniques, deceptive climbs, and unconventional dive attacks as core skills. Squadron leaders emphasized creative thinking alongside traditional gunnery, highlighting the importance of flexibility in high-stakes situations. Engineers also contributed by reinforcing aircraft for stress tolerance, improving control surfaces, and ensuring that planes could safely perform high-risk maneuvers without structural failure. The combined effort of pilots, commanders, and technical teams forged a new doctrine, one where adaptability, observation, and courage were valued as much as raw firepower. Yet mistakes continued to serve as cautionary tales. Miscommunication between wingmen during inverted maneuvers sometimes resulted in mid-air collisions. Some pilots, overly confident in the tactic's success, underestimated the skill of experienced enemy aces. These failures reinforced a fundamental truth. Innovation alone could not guarantee victory. It required discipline, training, and constant adaptation. The breakthroughs achieved in these months were significant, but they were part of a continuous learning process, one that demanded vigilance and humility alongside bravery. By the end of 1943, the cumulative effect of these tactics was undeniable. American squadrons were increasingly confident in engaging Japanese formations, and the effectiveness of previously feared bombers declined. The integration of creativity and audacity into formal combat doctrine had reshaped air strategy in the Pacific, setting the stage for subsequent victories at Saipan, Peleliu, and beyond. What began as a desperate attempt to survive against an apparently invincible enemy had evolved into a defining element of American aerial warfare, one that would influence pilots for generations to come. The captured Betty bomber, once a puzzling enigma, had indirectly sparked this transformation. Its exposed fuel tanks, initially perceived as a glaring weakness, became a symbol of insight. Understanding the enemy's assumptions could unlock opportunities for innovation. In the crucible of combat, the combination of observation, ingenuity, and daring maneuvering had produced a tactical renaissance, one that forever altered the skies over the Pacific. The skies of the Pacific had long since fallen silent over the wreckage of war, yet the lessons learned there echoed far beyond the islands and oceans where American pilots had battled the Japanese. The audacity of inverted dives, deceptive maneuvers, and unorthodox attack patterns left an indelible mark on the history of aerial warfare. What began as a desperate experiment to counter seemingly invincible aircraft became a testament to the power of innovation, courage, and the human mind's ability to adapt under pressure. The pilots who first dared to invert their planes and strike from the unexpected were forever changed by the experience. The Lieutenant Commander Edward Ted Lawson, Major Paul Pappy Gunn, Lieutenant James Eberhart, and countless others became living embodiments of the principle that innovation often carries risk, and that risk, when measured against necessity and skill, can produce extraordinary results. Many survived to pass their knowledge on, shaping training programs, doctrine, and the culture of the United States Air Force for decades. Some, tragically, did not survive. Their courage, however, became part of a legacy that inspired future generations of aviators to challenge convention and think beyond the prescribed rules of engagement. The Betty bomber, with its unprotected fuel tanks, remained a symbol of paradox, a design that appeared vulnerable, yet exploited tactical cunning and pilot skill to devastating effect. Its capture and study forced American aviators to confront assumptions, question norms, and ultimately innovate. In doing so, it demonstrated a fundamental truth of warfare, and perhaps of life itself. Vulnerability is not always weakness, and apparent flaws can become opportunities for insight. By daring to see the world differently, pilots discovered strategies that shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. The broader implications extended into the philosophy of military strategy. Victory was no longer determined solely by numbers, firepower, or technology. It required imagination, adaptability, and a willingness to embrace the uncertain. A pilot's mindset, sharp, creative, and courageous, could transform limitations into advantages. This realization would influence post-war aviation, shaping jet tactics, aerobatics, and modern combat doctrine. The innovation born from necessity during these battles became a foundation for the next era of air warfare, proving that human ingenuity could elevate machinery into an instrument of decisive impact. Yet beyond doctrine and statistics, the story resonates on a deeply human level. It is a story of curiosity sparked by an enigma, of courage faced with impossible odds, and of the relentless pursuit of understanding in the midst of chaos. The captured Betty bomber was not just a machine. It was a question, a challenge, a catalyst. It forced pilots to look beyond fear, to confront the unknown, and to imagine solutions where none seemed possible. The result was a fusion of intellect and bravery, of daring innovation grounded in meticulous observation and disciplined execution. As the sun sets over the Pacific, the roar of engines may have faded, but the lessons endure. In the inverted dives, the daring maneuvers, and the triumphs born from desperation, we see a timeless truth. Progress often comes not from following the rules, but from questioning them, daring to fly differently, and trusting in the combination of skill, intellect, and courage. In the end, the legacy of those pilots is a reminder that innovation carries a price, but it also carries the power to change history. One man's idea, one daring maneuver, one moment of insight can echo through the skies, long after the battles are over, leaving a mark that transcends time and inspires generations to come. And as we reflect on the daring feats above the Pacific, we are left with a simple, profound truth. Courage and imagination, when paired with action, have the power to transform the world, even in the midst of war.